Ukraine didn't see it coming. Its only sign that a new type of missile was heading its way came from the streaks of light that shot through the darkened skies of Dnipro as the missiles touched down. Each of those streaks was a message from Russian President Vladimir Putin. He was ready to unleash a missile, unlike anything Ukraine had seen before. But the strike also carried a warning for the UK and the United States. Both have attracted Putin's ire for permitting Ukraine to use their long-range missiles in Russian territory. With the attack on Dnipro, Putin was making it clear to both that he had the missiles he needed to strike military facilities in the US and the UK just as easily as he could strike any target he wanted in Ukraine. This is a new escalation in Putin's special military operation, one that could lead to Russia firing intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, and intermediate-range ballistic missiles, or IRBMs, at new Western targets. So let's start with the obvious question: what actually happened? On November 21, 2024, Russia launched yet another missile strike against Ukraine, this time targeting the city of Dnipro. This hardly seems like news at this point in the war. Missile and bomb strikes on Ukrainian cities and military targets are an almost daily occurrence in Putin's campaign against the country he wants to absorb into the Russian Federation. But as footage captured by Sky News of the missiles raining down shows us, one stood out from the rest. Unlike the others streaking through the skies at lower altitudes, the missile seemed to plummet almost vertically downward, falling from the Earth's upper atmosphere. That's because it was. This single intermediate-range ballistic missile, IRBM, marked the first use of such a weapon in this war, taking the Ukraine conflict to an entirely new and perilous level. Putin later confirmed what had happened in a televised address to the Russian people. He told them that Russia had just fired a new hypersonic medium-range ballistic missile at Dnipro in what he called a direct response to the West escalating the war. Interestingly, Russia was initially slow to confirm the news. During a live briefing, Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova received a phone call, during which a male voice instructed her not to comment on the ballistic missile strike on the Yuzhmash plant. This exchange was inadvertently broadcast, revealing the sensitive nature of the information. But the Kremlin didn't want any old Russian to reveal the news. Putin wanted to do it himself. Russia's president sat in front of television cameras to deliver his message to Ukraine's Western partners. If you continue to allow our enemy to use your weapons in our territory, we can respond by attacking your military facilities. Therein lies the most interesting part about Russia's Dnipro strike. The missile Russia fired was not only hypersonic but nuclear-capable. Thankfully, as the New York Times reports, the missile only carried dummy warheads, rather than the nuclear payload it's able to hold. Still, Russia's new missile strike wasn't an attack on Ukraine, at least not in the same way that most of its attacks are. It was a warning to the West. Putin made that abundantly clear when he told reporters during his televised address that we consider ourselves entitled to use our weapons against the military facilities of those countries that allow their weapons to be used against our facilities. He went on to claim that any escalation of what he dubbed aggressive actions would be met with a decisive response from Russia. Russia's leader is ready to use ICBMs and IRBMs against Western targets. And the next question is simple: why? This latest escalation stems back to the decision outgoing US President Joe Biden made to allow Ukraine to use its long-range ATACMS missiles in Russian territory. CNN, along with many other news outlets, reported on that decision on November 17th. Based on information received from a pair of officials in Washington, it said were familiar with the situation. Official confirmation of Biden's decision arrived around a week later. On November 25th, Business Insider reporter Jake Epstein posted comments made by White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby to X. Kirby said Ukraine are able to use ATACMS to defend themselves in an immediate need basis, and right now, understandably, that's taken place in and around Kursk. The advisor went on to say, "We did change the guidance and gave them guidance that they can use them to strike these particular types of targets." So we see official confirmation from the United States regarding Ukraine's use of its long-range missiles. We haven't quite seen the same from the United Kingdom yet, but British Prime Minister Keir Starmer all but said Ukraine could use its long-range Storm Shadow missiles in much the same way as they're using ATACMS on November 21st. The UK's support for Ukraine is always for self-defence, said Starmer when speaking in Britain's Parliament. It is proportionate, coordinated and agile, and a response to Russia's own actions, and it's in accordance with international law, the Prime Minister said. Starmer stayed tight-lipped on whether he'd granted permission for Storm Shadow usage, but the reality is that he didn't need to say anything. Ukraine itself proved that it had gotten the go-ahead from Britain's leader days after Starmer addressed Parliament. That brings us to Ukraine's ATACMS and Storm Shadow strikes. The first came just a day after news of Biden's policy reversal started to make the rounds. On the war's 1,000-day anniversary, Ukraine delivered a very special present to Putin, a delivery of at least 6 ATACMS missiles. Reuters reports that Russia claims it managed to shoot down 5 of the 6, which were all aimed at a military facility in the Bryansk Oblast. However, debris from one of the missiles managed to land on the facility, starting a fire that Russia says it quickly put out. Ukraine's take on the event was slightly different. It confirmed that it had struck an arms depot about 70 miles into Bryansk, with the strike causing several secondary explosions. The number of missiles fired was also disputed. A US official claimed Ukraine had actually used 8 and that Russia only managed to intercept 2. Whatever the case may be, the attack marked confirmation of America's decision to allow ATACMS usage inside Russia before any official word came from the White House. And Ukraine has been taking advantage of restrictions being lifted ever since. France 24 reports that Ukraine has launched 2 more ATACMS strikes in the weeks following the attack on the Bryansk ammunition depot. The strikes, which took place on November 23rd and 25th respectively, targeted several military installations and a key airfield in the Kursk region, where Ukraine is currently fending off a 50,000-strong counteroffensive against the territory it took from Russia in August 2024. That defense involves 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers. Having ATACMS available to destroy key Russian logistics and aerial support is a massive boon to these soldiers' chances of holding what they've taken in Kursk. The Eurasian Times provided more details about the airfield strike. It says that Ukraine's ATACMS missiles touched down at an airfield named Kalino, which is around 60 miles from the country's border with Russia. Dramatic explosions were seen racking the airfield in footage shared on social media sites, with the video appearing to show Ukraine using the cluster variant of the ATACMS. This missile contains submunitions that splinter away from the main missile, allowing for damage over a larger radius. As for the November 23rd strike, that hit Kursk, which is about 60 miles away from the border. But what about Storm Shadow? Well, Ukraine is using that too. On November 22nd, Sky News reported on the first confirmed usage of Storm Shadow missiles inside Russian territory. It spoke to unnamed senior military sources who claimed that the strike was very successful. A later Financial Times report claims that the Storm Shadow strike managed to injure a key North Korean general in the Kursk region, along with killing several officers, all based at a Russian command center in the oblast. The general's identity wasn't disclosed, but we know that Ukraine's Storm Shadow missile touched down in a town named Marino, and that they were accompanied by several other strikes using different weapons, aimed at taking out a portion of the North Korean command structure. If you're wondering why we're mentioning North Korean soldiers in Kursk, it's because Putin's 50,000-strong Kursk counteroffensive includes most, if not all, of the 10,000-plus soldiers that North Korea has sent to Russia as part of the two countries' cooperative defense pact. The Storm Shadow attack, along with the second and third ATACMS strikes, all came in the wake of Putin firing his new ballistic missile at Dnipro, and they carried the clear message that Ukraine wasn't going to be scared away from using its long-range missiles against Russia, and that's what will terrify Putin. He'd hoped the Dnipro strike would be enough to stop Ukraine from taking full advantage of ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles in the aftermath of Ukraine's successful attack in Bryansk. That hasn't happened. If anything, Dnipro seems to have encouraged Ukraine to intensify its strikes against key Russian positions in and around Kursk as it pushes to retain its hard-won Russian territory. And Russia's president also has to face up to the prospect that many more of his key military sites fall within range of ATACMS and Storm Shadow. The Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, says that there are 245 known Russian military and paramilitary objectives that currently fall within the range of Ukraine's ATACMS. That assumes Ukraine has received the variants of the missiles that can travel for almost 190 miles. Those locations include airfields, ammunition depots, and command centers, all of which Ukraine has targeted in the last week or so. ISW also says 16 airfields fall under that 245 target umbrella, though Russia has already moved its aircraft from these sites in the wake of Biden lifting America's ATACMS restrictions. Storm Shadow missiles can't quite travel as far as ATACMS. They have a range of about 155 miles. But you have to imagine that they can hit many of the 245 targets the ISW highlights too. So we've seen a lot happen in the Ukraine war, in the week covering November 18th to 25th. President Biden granted approval for Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles against Russia, which it did on November 19th. Russia responded by using its ballistic missile in Dnipro, while delivering threats to the US and UK that he could use these missiles on their military facilities if ATACMS and Storm Shadow continued to be used against Russia's facilities. Neither country seems to have listened. Since the Dnipro strike, we've seen 2 more confirmed uses of ATACMS inside Russia, alongside a use of Storm Shadow that's apparently killed several high-ranking North Korean officers. It was a big week, but we've missed something out, a development that set the stage for Putin to make his threats against US and UK military installations. Russia has approved a new nuclear doctrine. On November 19th, a day after news of Biden's approval of ATACMS usage, and just hours before Ukraine's first strike on Russia using the weapon, Putin signed into law changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine. Those changes laid the groundwork for the threats he's now making to US and UK military facilities. Under the new doctrine, Russia claims that any attack on its territory by a non-nuclear state, such as Ukraine, that's supported by a nuclear state, such as the US or UK, will be considered a joint assault on Russia. In other words, Ukraine's use of ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles to attack targets inside Russia could be grounds for Russia to launch a nuclear response, not only at Ukraine, but the US and UK as well. There are caveats to this doctrine change. The BBC says that the strike against Russia has to be a large attack that uses aircraft, drones, or conventional missiles, the latter covering Ukraine's long-range missiles. The new doctrine also covers Belarus, which is a key Russian ally and one of the countries Putin used to stage his special military operation, and any other attack that Russia considers a threat to its sovereignty. The move has prompted claims that Russia is once again rattling its nuclear saber. The country's foreign minister Sergei Lavrov says that isn't the case, stating that we strongly are in favor of doing everything to not allow nuclear war to happen. The Dnipro strike says differently. So do Putin's threats against the Western countries supporting Ukraine with their missiles. Russia has used Dnipro to show the US and UK that it has new and functional ICBMs and IRBMs that it's willing to use. And under Russia's new nuclear doctrine, there may be nothing stopping Putin from packing those missiles with nuclear warheads in the future. Russia is ready to use its missiles to attack the West, or so Putin seems to be claiming. That brings us to another key question. What does Russia's attack on Dnipro really mean? We've touched on one aspect already. Dnipro was as much of a warning to the West as it was a strike on a Ukrainian city. Putin made that much clear in his televised broadcast in the wake of the missile attack. He dubbed the new Russian missile Oreshnik, which translates to hazel tree, and said its deployment was a response to US plans to produce and deploy intermediate and short-range missiles in Ukraine. Putin also added that Russia reserves the right to use its weapons against targets in countries that permit their weapons to be used against Russian targets. The Guardian calls that the most explicit threat he's made to Western nations during the entire war. We've already seen that neither the US nor UK responded the way Putin wanted. However, The Guardian also reports that both countries were quick to analyze the missile Putin sent Dnipro's way. They've concluded that Oreshnik is nuclear capable and likely has a theoretical range of 3,420 miles. That would easily put the UK at risk of an Oreshnik strike in the future if Putin follows through on his threats. The missile would also likely be able to reach several American targets on the country's east coast, with Russia perhaps being capable of also launching the Oreshnik at Alaska. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was also quick to point out that Putin seems to be using Ukraine to send a threat to the West. Obviously, Putin is using Ukraine as a testing ground. Obviously, Putin is terrified when normal life simply exists next to him. Posting to Telegram, Zelensky also claimed that Russia's use of its new missile was final proof that the country doesn't want peace. It's also notable that Putin didn't launch the Oreshnik unannounced. Moscow pre-notified Washington around 30 minutes before the missile touched down in Dnipro. On one hand, we could see this as Russia wanting to avert any threat of retaliation, as it would have told the US that the missile didn't carry a nuclear warhead. On the other hand, we could also see this as notification as another of Putin's threats. This time, we told you. Next time, you might not be so lucky when those missiles come hurtling toward your military bases. Beyond sending a warning, Putin also delivered a secondary message with his televised address. He said, "The regional conflict in Ukraine, previously provoked by the West, has acquired elements of a global character," as he decried America deploying missiles in Europe and the Asia-Pacific. There's quite a bit to unpack here, starting with Putin's claim that the Ukraine war was somehow provoked by the West. It wasn't. Putin's imperialistic ambitions that fuel his desire to reintegrate Ukraine into Russia were the reason he launched his special military operation. He just didn't expect Ukraine to receive the support that it has from the West, which he is now reframing as the West provoking a conflict he started. typical Putin spin. Russia's leader's hypocrisy also shines through when he claims that the US and UK allowing Ukraine to use missiles in Russia has given the war a global character. Yes, many Western countries have supported Ukraine with weapons since February 2022, but it's only since mid-November 2024 that they've allowed Ukraine to use the most dangerous of these weapons inside Russia. Before that, the weapons Ukraine received were earmarked for self-defense only. In contrast, Putin has happily relied on his global partners to deliver weapons that he has used in Ukraine. Take North Korea as an example. The 10,000-plus soldiers Russia has received from its close ally may be restricting their efforts to Kursk, at least for now, but the same can't be said for the weapons Russia has received from North Korea. The Guardian reports that North Korea has sent over 13,000 containers of missiles, artillery, and conventional arms to Russia since August 2023. You may note that this is a full year before Ukraine invaded Kursk, meaning those munitions weren't being used to defend Russian territory. Putin used them to attack Ukraine. Iran has also provided Russia with plenty of weapons. Britain's parliament says that Iran has sent hundreds of drones to Russia since August 2022, 2 years before the Kursk invasion, that Putin has used in his aerial strikes against Ukraine. The Atlantic Council also points out that Iran shipped close-range ballistic missiles to Russia sometime around September 2024, and likely before, that could be used in Kursk or to attack Ukraine. So yes, the Ukraine war has a global character, but it was Russia that was the first country to use weapons it got from its allies to attack another nation. Ukraine just responded in kind long after those first Russian attacks. Mr. Putin, your hypocrisy is showing. Nevertheless, Putin's ability to play the blame game while ignoring that the UK and US allowing the use of their long-range missiles against Russia is a consequence of his own actions doesn't distract from the very real threat Dnipro represents. Putin has shown 2 of Ukraine's key Western allies that he has missiles capable of reaching their territory. He's used those missiles, albeit without nuclear warheads, to show just how powerful those strikes can be. Make no mistake, the Dnipro strike represents another escalation of the war. That's the opinion of Tatiana Stanovaya, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. This is an escalation, she says. I really believe the situation is very dangerous. That's backed up by the fact that Dnipro is well within range of the conventional weapons Russia has used throughout the war. The use of Oreshnik sent a message. As University of Oslo weapons expert Fabian René Hoffman points out, what they would like to tell us today is that, look, last night's strike was non-nuclear in payload, but you know, if whatever you do continues, the next strike might be a nuclear weapon. That's bad news for the UK and US military sites that may now be on Russia's radar. But we also have to think about what the Dnipro strike means for Ukraine. Ivan Krychevsky is a military analyst with the Ukrainian consulting agency Defense Express. Speaking to the New York Times, he confirmed that Ukraine's Air Force was able to determine that the Oreshnik missile launched at Dnipro came from the Astrakhan region of Russia. It also learned that the missile was likely fired from a truck located in the Kapustin Yar training range, which used to serve as a testing ground for Soviet missiles and other weaponry during the Cold War. The problem is that all of that information came after the launch. Krychevsky says that Ukraine doesn't have radar capable of detecting missiles that take flight through Earth's upper atmosphere, which is what the Oreshnik IRBM did. It also doesn't have any air defense systems capable of shooting such a missile down if it did manage to spot it. Our Western partners might have seen this launch before us, says the analyst, perhaps hinting that Ukraine will need more support from the UK and US if Putin decides to start using missiles like Oreshnik more regularly. We also can't ignore the nuclear aspect of these types of missiles and what that might mean for Ukraine. Tom Karako, who directs the Center for Strategic and International Studies Missile Defense Project, says that these types of missiles deliver nuclear payloads in a way that makes them almost impossible for Ukraine to stop. What makes the Oreshnik so alarming compared to other nuclear-capable missiles Russia has used, like the Iskander and KH-101, is its ability to unleash multiple nuclear warheads upon re-entering Earth's atmosphere. The Oreshnik and Iskander's hypersonic speeds would overwhelm Ukraine's defenses, while the slower subsonic KH-101 still poses a significant threat due to its ability to evade radar at low altitudes. Karako says Russia's move is a nuclear saber-rattling for both Ukraine and Europe itself. It's a pretty sharp signal, and it's a signal that neither the US nor the UK can afford to ignore. Yes, it doesn't seem like Putin is willing to plunge us all into nuclear Armageddon just yet. The fact that Russia alerted the US to its Oreshnik strike before it happened demonstrates that. But the threats Putin made along with the strike can't escape notice. Russia just used a weapon that's very difficult to detect and flies out of the range of most anti-air defenses. As concerning as that is for Ukraine, the UK and US must realize that their military installations are also vulnerable if Putin chooses to turn that missile against them. Putin has just said that's a possibility. The Dnipro strike was an instance of Russia proving its strength and attempting to intimidate the US and UK into revoking Ukraine's permission to use their long-range missiles inside Russia. So far, the threat hasn't worked. Ukraine has carried out 3 attacks on Russia using long-range missiles since the Dnipro strike. The final question is simple. Will Putin follow through on his threats to target British and American military facilities if the ATACMS and Storm Shadow strikes in Ukraine continue? We'll leave the answer to that question to you. What do you think about Putin's latest threats? Are they more barking from a leader who's shown repeatedly that he's not willing to back up the threats he makes to the West? Or should Russia's new ICBM give the US and UK pause to think about how far it wants to support Ukraine? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Russia's top nuke targets, or click this other video instead.